Many success stories have been shared of the thousands of Barbadians who assembled here to research information and to simply borrow a book. Unfortunately, those activities are no longer engaged in at this site. We are, however, hopeful that this monument will be restored to its former glory. Professor Sir Henry Fraser shares this belief.
You know, I breathe, I read, and books to me are as much a part of my life as breathing. So the Carnegie Library has always been very special to me. It opened on January the 26th, 1906. And what is remarkable and very ironic is that it closed to celebrate its centenary, you might say, in 2006. 100 years later, it closed. Now, what do we mean by the Carnegie Library, and why is it called the Carnegie Library? It's because it's the gift of an amazing man called Andrew Carnegie, who was the most famous rags to riches man perhaps in the entire world. He was a very poor Scottish boy, and he and his family lived in a little one-room home in Dunfermline near Fife in Scotland. It was an exceedingly poor family. One room for a whole family. They lived and they slept in that one room. And eventually his family emigrated to America, and they went to Pennsylvania when he was 13 years of age. So he had good schooling at primary school, insofar as a small village school could provide a certain amount of schooling. He could obviously read and write. When he went to America, he became initially a messenger boy, and then he got a job as a telegraph boy, a telegraph operator, and was promoted within that system, and then he went to work on the railways. And he became exceedingly well recognized among his peers and among the people he worked for. Someone opened his doors to young Carnegie to use his library. So he educated himself in that older man's friendly library. And by the age of 24, he was a supervisor of a large segment of the Pennsylvania Railway. And he started investing his earnings. He started as a messenger boy at $1.20 a week. Just imagine, $1.20, with which you can buy nothing today, a week for his work as a messenger boy. But by the age of 30, he was into the production of steel, and he started the Carnegie Steel Company. And within 20 years, he became the richest man in America. He was an amazingly clever man and a successful man, and he worked well with people. He had a great personality, so he charmed people and he got the work done. He became the richest man in America, and eventually he started giving his money away. Now, when he was, I think, 35, he went off to Scotland and he provided the money for a library in his home village of Dunfermline. And that was the first free library that he created. But because he had had this yearning for knowledge and the absence of proper schooling after the age of 13, he decided that libraries were the things to do with his money. And he developed a philosophy that wealthy people with surplus wealth should give money away. They should give back in a big way. He wrote many articles, he wrote several books, and he wrote something called The Gospel of Wealth. And in that he indicated that people who spent their first part of their life acquiring knowledge, experience, and skills should spend the middle part of their life earning significant wealth to give it away in the third part of their life. And this is exactly what he did. So the last 25 to 30 years of his life, he was giving his money away. He gave away $30 million US dollars over that period. And that today has been estimated at $6 billion worth. So he has been America's greatest benefactor, not just of America, but of the world. Because he started building libraries, or rather providing the money to build libraries all over the USA. Every significant town had a library built with Andrew Carnegie's funds. And then he went back to Britain, and he had Carnegie libraries built in Britain. And then he decided English-speaking countries around the world. So he had libraries built in places from Canada to the Caribbean and from France to the Fiji. And the Caribbean benefited with 6 of his libraries. The first one was in Barbados, the beginning of the year, January 26, 1906. And he gave £5,000, which in those days built on a magnificent 2-story Italianate building with block coral stone and beautifully carved stone. Our artisans were able to work with the coral stone and create those beautiful finials at the corners of the building and all the carving that went with the doors and the pediments and the entrance of that design.
My greetings to the 21st century. My name is Andrew Carnegie, and I see this building that I gave the money to build in Barbados is still standing after more than 100 years. I'm happy to learn that for 110 years, thousands and thousands of Barbadians have benefited from this public library.
And in the same year, he provided a library in Dominica. Now, Dominica is a wooded island. They don't have coral stone. So the library there, with the smaller city of Roseau, is much more modest, and it's built of wood. And I visited that library as well. And then the following year, 2 more Caribbean libraries, Guyana, Georgetown, and Kingstown, St. Vincent. And then finally, the last 2 came a decade later, the one in St. Lucia and the one in San Fernando in South Trinidad. I don't know why there was none in Jamaica. For some reason, Jamaica maybe didn't need one. I'm not sure of the facts there. But he went for, if you might put it this way, some of the smaller Caribbean islands, but the best known, and where he felt the great need was greatest. And so these libraries created a supply that was badly needed. Barbados had talked about reading rooms and public libraries in the 19th century, but nothing decent had ever really been created. We've talked about that in other spheres. But this library was superb. Downstairs was the main library with all the archives. Upstairs was the children's section. The ceiling on the upper floor is a beautiful ceiling, and the staircase to ascend to the upper floor, I always had the concept as a child, what a wonderful climb to the fountain of knowledge at the top of these great stairs. And eventually the Carnegie was expanded to accommodate what became known as the West Indies Reference Section, and that's a new building to the north. But it was outgrowing itself. And libraries have multiple purposes. In the last days of the Carnegie Library, they tried to hold some exhibitions, like photographic exhibitions, art exhibitions, and these couldn't be held among the stacks, so they tended to be held in the wing which accommodated the librarians' desks. So you would be walking between the librarians' desks looking at these wonderful pictures on the wall, because libraries need exhibition space. The modern library is a library that is an information center. Modern libraries not only have the stacks with the books, but the vast array of journals that have the new knowledge that is being earned, accumulated year after year, and they need to have computer spaces. So modern libraries have carousels for computer use, and they have librarians trained in finding data. Now, you and I can't easily, I speak only for myself, not for you, but many of us do not have the skills to do really successful searches for information. And a well-trained librarian can do what the average person cannot do. So the modern library has the stacks for the books, it has the stacks for the journals, it has carousels with lots of computers, and it has trained librarians whom we call information gurus. And then it has interlibrary connections, because every library can't have everything. So it will stack the journals and the books, for example, that are most popular, that are most relevant, but it will have interlibrary loans and computer-related internet connections with other libraries, so that if you read an article and you have a reference to something that you cannot get yourself, and it's not on the web, because contrary to popular belief, the world's information is not all on the web, only a tiny portion. So this is the problem that we recognized when the Carnegie Library was closed, that it gave an opportunity for the development of a really modern, efficient library. I was given the task, the privilege, if you like, of leading a task force established by the Prime Minister way back in 2013, I think it was, to develop a policy and a program for raising money to restore the derelict buildings of Barbados. And it was hinted that the Carnegie Library and Queen's Park House should be at the top of our priority list. Now, I was given this task because I had been successful with a very, very efficient team each time in raising $1 million to buy and restore Tyrrell Court, $1 million for Codrington College restoration, and then $1.5 million for the Chronic Disease Research Centre development. So I think the assumption was made, well, if I could raise nearly $4 million for these projects, maybe we could do the same for the built treasures of Bridgetown that were going derelict. Well, it didn't work like that because we'd had the financial crash of 2008. But the library was a particularly difficult subject because what we did was to create a plan for the library, and with the director of the library services and the disused, rapidly deteriorating old Supreme Court next door, what the Director of Library Services and my team discussed was the possibility of not just restoring the Carnegie Library, but incorporating the old Supreme Court to provide the expanded room that you needed for a modern library, where we could have exhibition space and computer labs. Well, things didn't go well. We created the proposal and we set about raising funds. The Christopher Holder Foundation, the very, very generous Christopher Holder Foundation, which at the time had given the government of Barbados about $25 million, they agreed to give us the funding to hire someone for 2 years who would be the officer, the administrator of this fund activity. And we were fortunate because we put out an ad, the task force put out an ad requiring applicants for this executive job, and we had something like 35 applicants. We had several potential contenders, but there was one star, Mrs. Carol Bishop, who had recently retired from her post at the Barbados Light and Power. She took it on, and she was amazing. She worked 24/7 in terms of the fundraising efforts. What was sad, however, while we had some initial donations of $10,000 and $20,000, we could not get the big donations. And I remember distinctly the tragedy, the very sad and disappointing effort where Carol and I made a presentation with a slide presentation of the 10 massive new libraries in the world. Big libraries, 10-story libraries in cities that had been created in the 21st century. The restoration of the famous Library of Alexandria, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The 10-story library that I toured at the time in Aberdeen, which had just been built. And we presented that to a very prosperous company in Barbados. And a member of the board said, but, you know, this is all very well, but who needs a library anymore? It's all on your smartphone. And I made the point, but it didn't register. I made the point that at the time, Sir Woodville Marshall and Henderson Carter had created a proposal for a dictionary of Barbados biography and put together a team of historians. And I'd been given the task of working up the bios of some 35 Barbadians over the past 2 centuries. And what was astonishing and disappointing was that when you put these names and their role into the computer and search the web for information of them, I could only find information on 7 or 8 of them. People like prime ministers and attorneys general, and you could only get into this dictionary if you had been dead 10 years, because the view of the historians was that people are often reassessed after death, and the role that they played is not clear at the time of their death. So the point I made was that here was I looking for 35 important Barbadians, and the web just didn't have the information. We had to go to the Barbados Public Library, temporarily accommodated over in old Independence Square, and we had to go to the library at the Barbados Museum, which has a wonderful library of archives with history of Barbados. And they were the main sources, apart from the many books that people like me had in my own library. So libraries are essential, and information searches are essential, because, for example, you may be very interested in the journal article about climate change, and you're going to have to find a way of tracking down that article. And if you have a library with connections with big libraries, like in Boston, for example, the National Library in America, then you can very readily get access to that journal article, which you otherwise simply would not be able to do. So that is why libraries have to be subtitled information centers. So our attempts to restore the Carnegie Library so far have been unsuccessful. Now, eventually, with people telling us we didn't need a library, with people who had given me $50,000 for the building of the Chronic Disease Research Center, or $50,000 for Tyrrell Cott, not wanting to contribute to the library, and with many business firms simply saying, you see the derelict buildings all over Bridgetown? This is just one of them, and it's no point, because the government will just let it fall down again. So eventually, I was so frustrated that I resigned as chairman of the task force and chairman of the charitable trust, and it was headless for a while, but eventually Jeff Ramsey was persuaded to take on the task. And so Jeff became the chairman of the task force and the trust. And Jeff Ramsey is an architect who has been very successful in getting major projects done in Barbados. He is the architect and the prime mover with the source of significant funding for what was called the synagogue block. He was involved, of course, in the initial work with Bruce Jardine and Paul Altman in the restoration of the original synagogue work. And then following the discovery of the mikveh with the spring in the yard of the synagogue, it was decided that the whole surrounding area, which was very much related to the synagogue site, should be restored, and the money was funded, and Jeff Ramsey coordinated that. So he's a man who has worked with government, and he gets things done. And I have to say that with the accession of the present government, with the reputation for their interest in the arts, because it was the government of 2007, when our present Prime Minister was Attorney General, who was responsible for introducing and passing the Act which established the National Art Gallery Committee and identifying Blocks A at the Garrison as the site for the National Art Gallery. So we still have high hopes that the government will establish that gallery. And similarly, we have high hopes that the government will promote the restoration of historic Bridgetown, because you will remember that historic Bridgetown, again, it was a developmental nomination committee that I chaired way back when. Historic Bridgetown was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 2010 on my birthday, just by chance, pure coincidence. And it was established really when there was a big function in Barbados in 2011. So we would like to think that the Garrison will be recognized, and the Carnegie Library, of course, was a prominent building listed and involved in the nomination of Bridgetown. So all of these historic buildings we would like to think will help us to preserve the status of historic Bridgetown and its garrison as a World Heritage Site. Because what has been found is that the natural and the built sites, especially the built sites, which get named as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, are a tremendous boost for tourism in those places. And tourism usually doubles within 5 years when you get a World Heritage nomination, if the governments should I say, capitalize on the labeling and the branding. So this is reason for us to think that the Carnegie Library will be restored. Because you see, the synagogue site, the Synagogue Museum, the Nidda Israel Museum, the Carnegie Library as an information source, the old fire station on the corner of the synagogue block, all of these are cultural centers which can attract people, so that both local people should be using the library, the restored library, and visitors would be interested in going to places like that with the amount of culture that there is to see around the synagogue and the synagogue block. It is really a no-brainer. And what we did to sensitize people, and it did to some extent the general population, because I couldn't walk down Broad Street without people talking to me about it. It was the man in the street who were more sensitized perhaps than the wealthy business people, was the film that Penny Heine made about the Carnegie Library. And she was able to persuade the famous Barbadian actor Patrick Foster to play the role of Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was an eminent, distinguished-looking man with a white grey beard in his later life, and so Patrick Foster with his beard made a very impressive Andrew Carnegie. And we used that film to popularize the idea of restoring the Carnegie.
A way of giving back from my own good fortune. One way was to donate free public libraries all over the hemisphere.
So it's still our hope that the Carnegie will be restored. It is now almost 20 years since it was shut in celebration of being 100 years old. Forgive my irony, but it was closed at the centenary. And we would like to think that it might be reopened at the 25th anniversary of its closure. That would be a nice date for it to be reopened. So we have just 18 months to 24 months to work on the Carnegie Library, and we hope that the government and the powers that be, as well as philanthropists who should be trying to emulate Andrew Carnegie. So let me end with the concept that Andrew Carnegie wrote about and practiced, because he put his money where his mouth is. He practiced what he preached with the gospel of wealth. Surplus wealth is wealth that responsible, wealthy people have an obligation to give to their communities for the benefit of those communities. He remains the greatest philanthropist in the world. The modern model, perhaps, is Bill Gates. We've had philanthropists in Barbados, like the owner of Morgan Lewis Mill, the owner of Andromeda Gardens, Mr. Bannister and Iris Bannicky have been great philanthropists, and there are other philanthropists in Barbados, Sir David Seal and others who have done magnificent work, and there are great philanthropists who keep the Verdun Rehab Center going. So there are philanthropists, but there are perhaps not enough philanthropists of the order of Mr. Carnegie. So let us hope that perhaps with some philanthropic help, but very much with the sense of responsibility that the government of Barbados owes to their promise of 123 years ago to keep the Carnegie Library going for the public of Barbados to use freely. That is the message of Andrew Carnegie, and I hope that our government would take back on the responsibility on which successive governments have reneged. Thank you very much.
You know, when I was asked to help, I had only one condition: that it always be a free library, free to all. Sadly, today I find that it's empty. But what a beautiful building. A real tribute to those who built it. So what are you planning to do about it?
We all wish to see the preservation of our natural and built heritage in Barbados, and each of us can contribute to that cause by donating to the Barbados National Trust. This has been Monuments. I'm Rashid Best. Thanks for your time.